Welcome to this week's With Liberty and Justice for Some. I'm Congressman Mark Pocan from Wisconsin's 2nd Congressional District. We have a great episode today. People are so tired of getting ripped off by billionaires and big corporations. And under the Trump administration, it's just getting worse. The income gap, the power of Elon Musk to turn on and off federal dollars while also getting federal dollars, $8 million a day. It's just grown to a problem that people can barely comprehend. And many of those regulators that fight to hold those big businesses accountable are being fired, and the consumer protections are being rolled back. My main guest for today's podcast is the former chair of the Federal Trade Commission, Lina. She is an amazing consumer advocate. She has done a terrific job on taking on price gouging, illegal mergers, corporate greed, and so much more. So we are going to have a great interview today with Lina. But first, we're going to ask a quick question to the senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Bill Hartung, who is taking on the issue so often of runaway Pentagon spending. Bill, thanks so much for being with us. My question for you is, if you could change any one federal law, what would it be?
Well, I think I would strengthen what should be well understood, that if we're going to go to war, you have to go to the Congress. Mm-hmm. You can't go to war first and then have Congress try to rein you in. And I know that's been debated, for many years now. But I think without that, the president just has too much discretion and too much power, and that shouldn't be one person's decision or a few people's decision.
And watching those authorizations we've given, they've been used pretty widely and loosely, haven't they?
Yeah, no, I think we could be a lot more restrained and everybody would be a lot safer, and we'd have money to invest in a lot of the other things we need.
And it's also the responsibility of Congress to do so. And unfortunately, we give up our authorization a little too loosely. Everyone in this country seems to be concerned about the cost of living. Well, maybe everyone but President Trump and congressional Republicans. The issue of the November elections was the cost of living, and most of the time, the biggest driver of additional cost was never even discussed, the lack of real competition in the marketplace. Fortunately, we have federal agencies that work on this and great public servants who take big companies to court when they use their monopoly power to rip off consumers. Mergers, bad practices, and more are all subjects of lawsuits that at the end of the day have more to do about higher costs than many other things that get a lot more attention. So today, we're going to give those issues some attention. And today we have a very special guest, someone who's been one of the nation's leading fighters for consumers, the immediate past chair of the Federal Trade Commission, Lina. Lina, you've served as the chair from 2021 to 2025. You've been a professor and are a professor right now, right, at Columbia Law School, and you're a national leader on antitrust. Even when you were a student, you're a national leader on antitrust. So who could be better to talk about some of the biggest yet often least discussed issues facing American consumers other than Lina. Lina, thanks so much for being with us. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it. Let's start because I think, when I talk about Federal Trade Commission, I think most people, including before I got to Congress, wouldn't fully understand what that meant. So, it's not a daily conversation point. What should we know about the Federal Trade Commission?
So Congress created the Federal Trade Commission in 1914 against the backdrop of the robber barons and the industrial trusts. And Congress created the agency to basically be a cop on the beat and to make sure corporations were not getting away with abusing or bullying or exploiting the American people. And so the agency enforces the nation's antitrust and consumer protection laws. And that means everything from blocking illegal mergers that would result in higher prices to taking on frauds and scams and illegal subscription traps and everything in between.
It's funny, and you can't see it because it's the picture in the background that's kind of on the side, so it's hard to tell, but that's Fighting Bob LaFollette from Wisconsin, a former U.S. senator who, made a lot of his career around fighting robber barons, right, in that era. So that's interesting to know about the background. And you were the chair. What exactly does that mean to be the chair of the FTC?
So the FTC is a multi-member commission. There are 5 commissioners. three of whom are usually from the president's party, and then there are two minority commissioners, and the president designates one of those five commissioners to serve as chair. The chair directs the staff, sets the priorities, sets the agenda. For the most part, you can only pursue law enforcement actions and rules through a vote of the commission, so you always need a majority. But the chair really sets the agenda and drives forward the priorities.
Great. So let's tackle some of the issues that you've led on, because there have been many. You are very aggressive at the FTC. We appreciate that on behalf of the American people. Let's just start. We got to do it because everyone's talking about the price of eggs and milk and ground beef. The Albertsons Kroger merger was one of, I think, one of your big successes, right? What does the market look like for consumers when it comes to grocery prices? And talk a little bit about that merger and why that was so important.
Yeah, I mean, this is true in food and agriculture, and it's true in so many other markets, which is that for decades now, we have seen wave of mergers and consolidation. And what happens when you have, companies merge is that oftentimes they are reducing competition in a market. And so in all sorts of agriculture markets, for example, you have millions of consumers on one end, tens of thousands of farmers on the other, but they're just connected by a handful of big meat packers or chicken processors. And that can lead to huge asymmetries of power, where those big companies in the middle can basically take a bigger and bigger cut, where you have farmers making less, consumers paying more, and the middleman just taking a larger cut in the middle. So this is something that we've seen systematically across agriculture markets. We've also seen a lot of consolidation in grocery markets. And I believe it was 2022 or 2023, Kroger and Albertsons announced a merger. This would have been the largest merger in the supermarket industry in U.S. history. And the FTC, after spending months investigating the deal, determined that this merger would violate the antitrust laws, that it would ultimately result both in higher prices at the grocery store, as well as worse conditions and worse pay for grocery employees, including unionized employees that had been able to benefit from the competition between Kroger and Albertsons. So we sued to block this merger. We had a trial in Portland, Oregon, and we were really thrilled to win this case. The judge determined the deal was illegal and the parties ultimately abandoned. It was really interesting because some of the arguments the companies were making was, Albertsons is being squeezed and they really need this merger to be able to stay afloat. But we also saw huge, dividends being given out and really a lot of benefits to shareholders. And so you always want to scrutinize what kinds of claims a company is making relative to its actions.
What percent, do you remember offhand what percent of the market they would have got with that merger?
It really varied depending on the city and the geography, but there were some markets where the only options were Kroger and Albertsons. And so if you merge, they would basically have a local monopoly.
Yeah, and even like Walmart, I think their market share is something like 25% of the grocery market, I think, right now.
Yeah, I mean, in some cities, Walmart is as big as 50%, but we found that despite Walmart's presence, allowing Kroger and Albertsons to merge would result in higher prices for people.
Because I remember, because I've been lucky because on appropriations, I serve on a subcommittee where you've come a few times, and I always love it when you came because you gave us a lot of good news about the work you were doing. And I remember that, it's really a handful or so of grocery chains that kind of run the whole market. When you don't have that competition, we're paying more. So when people talk about, the concern on prices, which was a big part of the November election, you were actually probably doing the most in the Biden administration to address this, and people probably never even heard about it.
Yeah, I mean, we heard a lot of concern about the Kroger Albertsons deal. We actually did a bunch of listening sessions around the country, including in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Denver, and just heard a lot of concern. We had people come with the sale paper from each grocery store and said, look, right now they're competing on the price of strawberries, they're competing on the price of milk. And if you allow these two companies to merge, that competition will go away. So people really get at a gut level that when you allow monopolies and a lot of consolidation, most American families really lose out.
Yeah. And that's certainly true also in healthcare. Every American obviously is affected by healthcare, one of the largest expenses in our country. Can you talk about FTC and how you've addressed healthcare, and if there's a couple major things you want to talk about, cases in that area?
Yeah, I mean, healthcare is such a big pain point for people, as we know. This is not a discretionary purchase. It's not like toasters or vacuum cleaner. People really depend on healthcare, and when it's unaffordable or of poor quality, it can really affect people's lives and be the difference between life and death. So we really prioritized healthcare markets. There are a whole set of reasons why all too often corporations can get away with pricing healthcare at exorbitant levels. And so we were scrutinizing the different sources of this. One thing we looked at closely was big pharma companies and what was some of the patenting tricks that they were pursuing. And for example, we found that the cost of asthma inhalers is much higher than you would expect, given that asthma inhalers have been around for decades. But for some reason, generics haven't really been able to make a lot of advances in the market. And we took a close look and found that the big inhaler manufacturers were listing patents in the FDA with the FDA for things like the plastic inhaler cap or the counter on the inhaler.
Yeah.
Really parts of the device that have nothing to do with the underlying drug ingredient or the underlying medicine. We thought this was illegitimate, and we sent a set of warnings and really challenged this use of patents. And 3 of the 4 big inhaler manufacturers announced that as a result of the FTC action, they dropped how much people have to pay out of pocket down from hundreds of dollars to just $35. So
That was
that's
huge, by the way. That was huge.
yeah, it was a real big win. We also really scrutinized hospital consolidation. We've seen that, in region after region, when you allow big hospitals to merge, all too often costs go up and quality goes down. We also scrutinized the role of private equity, which has been burrowing its way into all sorts of healthcare markets. And we heard a lot of concerns from ER doctors and all sorts of other healthcare workers about how when private equity comes in, they basically focus so much on these short-term financial metrics that it means their healthcare workers can't do their jobs properly. So we sued one of these big private equity companies for rolling up anesthesiology providers in Texas, resulting in higher costs. So that's just a small fraction of what we did, but healthcare was a big priority.
Yeah, I think this is worth talking a little more about too, because it is such a huge part. Like you said, it's not like a choice. You have to have healthcare. I'm reading a book right now. Someone sent me, they were an ER nurse for 20 years and they wrote about down in the Southwest part of the country, right? A story about private equity buying up hospitals and the impact on that. But, there's an example on pharmaceutical companies. And I have to admit, that's one that I pay extra attention to because I just see so much that is wrong that I never knew until I got to Congress, because we just didn't get this kind of information. But you successfully sued, I believe it's Sanofi, if I'm saying that right, or Sanofi. They were trying to purchase a new competitor's drug for a rare disease, and you sued them on the basis of monopoly. And if I understand it right, they were charging $750,000 annually for the treatment of the disease, and they were just trying to avoid competition in the area. Can you just drop about that case?
Yeah, this was a really important case for us, and it really sent an important signal to big pharma companies. So Sanofi had a monopoly on a drug for Pompe disease. This is a really devastating disease where basically people's muscles degenerate. It afflicts people oftentimes very young in age, so that we're talking about kids. And people who depend on this drug, especially if they don't have the right insurance, can end up paying, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for these drugs. There was a new upstart in the market, a company called Maze that was developing an alternative treatment for Pompe disease. And this treatment would actually have made life a lot better, because instead of, under Sanofi's medicine, having to go to the hospital regularly and get IV, Maze's treatment could just be taken orally as a tablet. And so it could have been a real game changer for people, as well as potentially bring down costs. And Sanofi announced they wanted to buy Maze. And this, after investigating, the FTC determined was illegal because it would eliminate the only real competition in the market. And we worried that Sanofi was already doing so well with its existing treatment. If it bought up this upstart, would it really have the same incentive to bring the new medicine to market as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible? And so we sued to block that deal. Sanofi walked away. Maze ended up partnering with another company, and now Maze's treatments are going to make it to market even faster than they would have with Sanofi, than if they'd partnered up with Sanofi. So it was a real important win. And this is why blocking these illegal mergers can be so important.
Yeah, no, huge win. And, what we hopefully will see more of maybe under the new FTC. I won't ask you that right now. But you also successfully sued Novant Health when they were trying to acquire a couple of North Carolina hospitals, which would have consolidated their power, I think, to having 65% in that immediate market. Unsurprisingly, that hospital had some of the highest out-of-pocket costs and was one of the most expensive hospital systems in the state. Can you talk a little bit about that case?
Yeah, so this was a challenge that the FTC filed. Merger had gone through, it would have resulted in higher prices for North Carolina residents, as well as a reduction in the quality of care, especially for critical services. So we sued to block this, ultimately won, the parties abandoned. And this was part of a whole set of cases we brought, taking on illegal hospital consolidation in places like California, Utah, New Jersey, Rhode Island. This was a countrywide focus for us.
Yeah. Any other big healthcare wins you want to highlight?
More generally, we were scrutinizing the role of these middlemen, these pharmacy benefit managers, which can play a very opaque role. But basically, they can help determine which medicines people get access to and what price. We filed a lawsuit noting that they have this rebate scheme, what some people have basically called a kickback scheme, where the drug manufacturers have to pay the PBMs these rebates to get access to pharmacies and being listed on formularies. And we found that this was systematically inflating the cost of insulin and making it so that even when cheaper forms of insulin were available, because of this rebate system, when people went to the pharmacy, they only had access to the more expensive form of insulin. So this is a lawsuit that is still ongoing. We also scrutinized this vertical integration by the PBMs, where they've basically now have their own mail order pharmacies, even as independent pharmacists are dependent on them. And so you can have this conflict of interest. We heard a lot of concern from independent pharmacies, which play a critical role in America, especially in rural parts of the country, where they're often providing core healthcare. And we heard from independent pharmacies that, basically these PBMs weren't playing fair. They were under reimbursing the independents, even as they were over reimbursing their own mail orders, sometimes to the tool of, tens of millions of dollars, and that this was really squeezing the independents and increasingly driving them out of business.
Yeah, it was funny. One day I was driving down to Greene County in my district, Monroe, Wisconsin, a little over 10,000 people, and went to the independent pharmacist on the square, and they had a petition they were getting people to sign about the PBMs because they were seeing some of these problems out there. So thank you for that. Let's switch to big tech. What are some of the issues that we should be watching when it comes to big tech? Because clearly, I think a lot of us have seen some of the biggest, most wealthy folks in big tech very active lately on the political side.
Yeah. And, this is something that has been an area of bipartisan concern, a real worry that a handful of tech giants have amassed outsized power over who gets to speak and be heard, or even, make a sale in online commerce. So this is something that the FTC scrutinized very closely. We sued Amazon for illegally monopolizing certain online commerce markets, where we found that Amazon now charges as much as $1 out of every $2 for small businesses that are trying to sell through Amazon. And they have systematically actually inflated costs for consumers because they've been able to get away with, illegally blocking out rivals and blocking competition that would force them to bring those costs down both for small businesses and for consumers. So that's a case that's going to go to trial next year. We also scrutinized all of the data collection practices of these big tech companies and data brokers more generally. All too often, companies are getting away with collecting all sorts of sensitive data on Americans, their health data, their precise location, the websites that they've been browsing, and then they sell that data in ways that really leaves people at risk, exposes them to all sorts of harm, from stalking to identity theft to discrimination. So we were very focused on holding these bad actors to account, brought a set of cases saying that it is, you cannot just sell people sensitive data if they have not actually given you permission. And so we were able to establish new case law on that. We also started scrutinizing this issue of surveillance pricing, where basically companies now have data on everybody, and it's increasingly creating the ability to charge you a different price from your neighbor for the exact same product, because they know, you may be in a slightly tough spot and they can get away with inflating prices for you. So this is something that we also started looking at.
I think Maxwell Frost might have just introduced some legislation around this in groceries, because I recently heard more about that. There was a Microsoft case also regarding acquiring Activision Blizzard, one of the games. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that case is still actually on appeal in the Ninth Circuit. But basically, we allege that, by buying up Activision, Microsoft would be illegally reducing competition. Activision had basically been this platform neutral service, and by pairing up with Microsoft, we worried that there would be, discrimination against other gamers, and also that they would basically create a walled garden, where instead of players having more freedom, they would instead have to just be in Microsoft's ecosystem and not be able to freely switch, and that would ultimately inflate costs as well. So that's a lawsuit that is still pending in the Ninth Circuit, although the companies did go ahead and merge.
Gotcha. Let's talk about big oil. That was one of the hearings, and I remember you brought up, and I'll tell you, I repeated that story 20 times, at least back home, talking about it. There was a case that Pioneer, an oil company, and Exxon, I think, was acquiring Pioneer, but you found out quite a bit about the practices in the oil industry. Can you just give a little narrative about what happened there?
Yeah, so these were, big oil companies that were looking to merge. And as we did the investigation, we found something very interesting, which was, the U.S. over the last few years has been facing a big boom in oil, in part because of new technologies that have allowed producers to, bring more oil to market. And so this should really be a moment where oil prices, have been coming down. What we found through this investigation was that some of these executives were actually talking very regularly to top OPEC officials. This is an oil cartel, a global oil cartel that helps them.
Foreign entity, right? Yeah, foreign entity. Yeah.
And basically, the conversations were suggesting that it would be better off for these oil producers if they produced less oil rather than bringing more to market. Because if they brought more to market, prices would be lower, they would make less. Whereas if they basically collectively kept production back, prices would be higher. And so, we were really troubled by this. We prohibited that executive from sitting on the board after the merger, brought an action here, and really, I think, sent a strong signal to the market that this type of, even tacit efforts to collude or these types of signals can violate the law.
Yeah, and I just remember you did an amazing job that day in the hearing talking about this and explaining it as people asked questions, because at that time gas prices were up and people were trying to figure out what was going on. And what doesn't get talked about is all the work that you do with the FTC around this, and those hidden stories of what really is happening when an oil company executive is conspiring with a foreign entity to supply or price fix like that. That's why we were paying more for gas. And I did some math, and I forget it now, but I did it at the time, just what a little fraction of that increased cost would be. It was huge to consumers. And again, thanks for that. Another area that I have to admit I have a personal interest in is in big defense. Obviously, We spend, almost now $1 trillion a year for the Pentagon, largely with defense contractors. And it used to be maybe you'd have 10 defense contractors bidding on something, so at least you had some ability to get a better price, even though I think everyone understands you overpay tremendously when we're getting things from defense contractors. But there's been a real consolidation in this area, and that's really affected things. And you've had some actions in that area as well. Could you just talk a little bit about within the defense sector, some of the consolidation and what that's meant to the United States? Because if you only have a couple places to go, clearly we're going to potentially be paying way too much.
Yeah, so this is another area where a more hands-off approach to antitrust meant that we've seen enormous consolidation. I mean, back in the 90s, we had, as many as 50 independent providers in some of these defense markets. We now basically have 5 major contractors. So we've gone from 50 to 5 in the span of, a few decades. And that's meant that there's less competition. And when the US is buying these systems, oftentimes they are paying more than they would because there's limited competition. It also can actually lead to all sorts of fragility problems. So, for example, there was a few years ago a natural disaster that hit this Louisiana factory. And as a result of that one natural disaster, the US actually lost access to domestic production of a basic type of gunpowder that basically we had entirely centralized in this one place. And because of this one disaster, suddenly the US was vulnerable where this basic supply was now in short supply.
Mhm.
And so there can be cost issues, there can be shortages. The FTC sued to block Lockheed's attempted acquisition of Aerojet, which would have basically eliminated America's last independent supplier of key missile propulsion inputs, risking higher prices to the government, as well as diminished innovation and quality in markets that are so critical to national security and defense. This was the first time that an antitrust agency had actually tried to block a merger in the defense industrial base in a very long time. And again, sent a big signal to the market. And we actually saw less consolidation in that space overall, I think in good part because of the FTC.
And, I'm going to give you an extra set of props on this one. Not that all the rest of these don't deserve major props, but, it's become in Congress, we find it very hard to cut spending to the Pentagon or actually have accountability. They've, failed 7 audits because it's become a jobs program in people's districts. They look at it as that as opposed to using taxpayer money wisely. And the fact that you are one of the few people who has been willing to take that on, thank you for that, because otherwise it just would continue and continue without ever being looked at. And it's for our national security, and it's also for the taxpayers. Labor non-compete contracts. So, I'm chair of the labor caucus, co-chair of the labor caucus, and I think something like 30 million workers, about 1 out of 5 workers are estimated to be under a non-compete contract. And I remember just the bizarre stories of Jimmy John's, Subway, making people sign non-compete contracts because somehow you'd learn a special way to make a sub, which, is laughable, but it's 1 out of 5 people in the country are under these non-compete. Now, there's certain areas where it makes sense. I totally get it, but it's certainly been abused. Can you talk about that and what work you've done in that area?
Yeah, so these non-compete clauses basically prohibit people from going to go work for a competitor or go to start their own competing business for a certain number of years. And these non-competes have expanded beyond the boardroom. So they now are affecting security guards, janitors, fast food workers, as you noted, journalists, healthcare workers. And the evidence shows that these non-competes can be really devastating, both for workers as well as for competition as a whole. We found that these non-competes can depress people's wages. And interestingly, these non-competes affect not just the worker that is directly covered by the non-compete, but even workers that aren't. Because what a non-compete means is that a certain worker is basically stuck in place. They're less likely to switch jobs. And that means there's less opportunity for other workers who may have a chance at that job if that worker left. And so this is something that affects the labor market as a whole. So wages are lower. we also found that this can really affect new business formation and innovation and competition because, we got a lot of comments from people saying things like, I'm working for a big company and it's made me realize that there's actually an opening in the market and I want to go be an entrepreneur and go set out on my own, but this non-compete means I can't. And so that means that, prices are higher than they would be. And we heard some devastating stories. We got 26,000 comments from Americans from every state. We heard from a bartender in Florida who had a non-compete. She's actually being harassed at her job. And so she, went to go find a different job at a different restaurant. And her employer threatened her with a lawsuit for tens of thousands of dollars. And so she had to worry about, do I continue to get harassed or do I risk this lawsuit? I mean, just choices that nobody should have to face in America. We heard from people who said that a non-compete meant that they missed out on watching their kids grow up because they had to commute across the country. Their non-compete, covered all of these states around Georgia, and they had to go fly across the country every week, and they just missed out, on these core things. And so these non-competes are really devastating. We ended up finalizing a rule that would have eliminated the vast majority of non-competes. Senior executives would have been treated differently. We got sued by big business groups, and the courts have come out in different ways. One court said the FTC's rule was totally lawful. Another court said it was not lawful. And so now that appeal is continuing, and we'll have to see what happens.
Wow. No, great work, though, again, in that area. Anything that, I try to cover some of the stuff, but anything else you're really proud of that I didn't mention in some areas that you want to mention, just let people know the type of work that you were doing at the FTC?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot. I guess just two other quick things I'll mention is, we were really focused on what are just some of these day-to-day indignities that people feel when they're just, going about ordinary transactions. And two things that jumped out. One was this issue of junk fees. So when you see, a certain price and then you go to check out and then actually it's, tens of dollars more expensive because of fees like service fees or convenience fees or ticketing fees, and you don't really know what you're paying for, but you have no choice.
Yeah.
We finalized a rule that would eliminate those junk fees for short-term lodging and ticketing. We wanted to go further, but, we had a bipartisan vote on this one. And so we're able to finalize it. We also brought a set of lawsuits, especially looking at big corporate landlords that had been using junk fees. And so, they would advertise one rent, somebody would pay the application fee, they would even sign the lease and then realize actually they were on the hook for hundreds of dollars more than was advertised. For things like, a trash fee or a payment portal fee. I mean, just really ridiculous stuff. We also took on subscription traps. And so we've seen that companies all too often make it very easy to sign up for a subscription, but absurdly difficult to cancel, where you have to, call somebody, but nobody picks up the phone, or you have to wait hours, or you have to go in person or do certified mail. And we thought, this is really problematic. It's deceptive. It's unfair. So we finalized a rule that will require that businesses make it as easy to cancel a subscription as it is to sign up. So if there is a one-click sign up, there has to be one-click cancel. This rule is actually set to go into effect in May. Again, big business groups have sued us and that litigation is proceeding, but the judge has rejected efforts to say the rule is paused. So, it's possible that within a couple of months, people's subscriptions will be much easier to cancel.
Good. I think I've been the victim of that. All my spare time, trying to deal with getting rid of the $35 annual subscription for something I don't want anymore. But, well, thank you for that. Last question really is just, what's your expectation or hopes with the Trump administration and the FTC moving forward?
I think it's too early to say. There have been some moves so far to actually keep in place some of the work that we did during the last administration, including keeping in place our merger guidelines and this new form that companies will have to fill out when proposing a merger. So that could be quite promising. But we'll have to, watch closely. I think we've all been quite troubled by suggestions that companies may be trying to get sweetheart deals or cozy up with the administration and get special favors. So I think we're all going to have to be very, very vigilant there.
Great. Lina, thank you so much. Really, truly, I think for many of us who call ourselves progressives, but it shouldn't just be obviously from progressives, because I hear it from constituents too. The work you did at the FTC was really extraordinary. And in the very best way, you were fighting on behalf of all Americans in a very nonpartisan way to get things done. And truly appreciate that. How can people follow you, Lina, if people want to know what work you're doing now or whatever you want to send them to follow? We want to make sure people have it.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. So you can follow me there at Lina M. Khan. I have a webpage where my publications are listed. And so and we're hoping to figure out how to keep this work going. Because there's so much enthusiasm and excitement across the country and taking on corporate abuse. I'd also be remiss if I just didn't note that you were so instrumental in your support for the FTC and encouragement of the FTC. I was so glad to get to visit your district and just was so grateful for your fantastic partnership.
Yeah, and thanks for saying that, because I forgot to even mention that you came to the district, and you also came to where a nursing home was being shut down, the only one in that county, and helping to highlight the issues around that. So, I mean, really extraordinary service to my district and the American people. Thank you for that. Thanks so much, Lina, for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.